Okay, so hello, it's my turn now, and I'm going to give you a talk which is kind of an advert for some work that I'm just starting, and but I thought maybe I'd start with this thing we talked a little bit about earlier, which is my project, and the name I gave this workshop is Expertise in Crises. So there's a specific sense in which I think of the pandemic as being a crisis. So the first thing has to do with the way in which it was this high uncertainty, kind of rapidly evolving situation, where there was this new virus, so there was a clear need for biomedical science, which explains some of the early emphasis on virology in particular. That science, though, was kind of rapidly evolving, it was multifaceted, so it was kind of clearly important. Decision makers wanted to rely on it, but they also couldn't wait for it in some sense. The reason they couldn't wait for it is because it was a deadly disease. It was spreading rapidly, it was damaging and deadly, and it seemed like a big response was needed, these significant, impactful policies. And those decisions needed to be made with limited time for research, especially, and even limited time for reflection when you read about some of the timelines. And the actual policies themselves as interventions were also subject to uncertainty. So not only do we not know much about the virus, but we didn't necessarily know how certain things would play out as sort of social policies. And then finally, there were these sort of trade-offs that seemed very difficult to avoid. We've heard about them, trade-offs between young and old, trade-offs between economic and health-based benefits. And these kind of factors and the difficulty that they create is the sort of situation that I'm interested in when I think about the pandemic as a crisis. And of course, in this situation, we saw these kind of experts suddenly taking this big role. There were these institutional experts who we've talked about, right? That's Fauci, Tegnell, and Chris Whitty. There were also these panels. And we've talked a lot about SAGE because we're here, but panels like this existed all over the place. Some of them, like the CTS in Italy, were these, like SAGE, they were established legislative frameworks for convening a panel. Others, like the South African one, was much more ad hoc. They just gathered together a group of experts to advise actually an ad hoc ministerial committee. And of course, there was the rhetoric telling us that we all needed to follow the science, that it was absolutely crucial. But the issue that I'm interested in is, well, those scientists really disagreed, especially early on, and especially when it came to modeling epidemiologists. In the early part of the pandemic, we saw these huge differences in models, but we also saw some disagreements that were about data. They weren't just about models, they were about interpretation. So this was, in early 2020, a debate hosted on this Unheard platform. That's Neil Ferguson. This person you may not recognize, his name is Johan Giesecke. He is a former Anders Tegnell. He was the previous chief epidemiologist in Sweden's public health agency. And they were asked, on the basis of evidence from China and Italy, what they thought the infection fatality rate was for the disease. And they gave estimates that were an order of magnitude apart. I think it was like 2% and 0.2%. Which obviously have massively different policy implications and just made life very difficult for people who were trying to rely on expert judgment. And it wasn't just Sweden, right? Both of these examples I've given were Sweden. There were these modeling differences about the US and the UK, depending on which modeling groups you looked at. The differences were extremely large and made things very difficult. So this was a news story reporting a factor of 3 that one group claimed the other was off by. So the first thing I think is, this is difficult, but it's also completely understandable, right? Like, there's this condition of crisis in which it's high uncertainty, that science is changing all the time. There's some core facts about policymaking, which is like policy problems don't neatly align to university departments. And so when you go to research scientists and you ask them to respond, they're going to give you these kind of different perspectives in much the way that Stephen was talking about. And when you ask them to advise you, when you ask them to weigh in on actions that you're going to take, you also get this entanglement of facts and values. And I think all of these things add together to make it kind of understandable in a sense why we got this expert disagreement. But it being reasonable doesn't mean that it's nice. It obviously makes life very difficult for various people. I mean, makes life difficult for the policymakers, it makes life difficult for the public to know what we should do, what we should believe. But I'm interested in the way in which it makes life difficult for those experts who themselves presumably question whether they're making a mistake when they encounter other experts who disagree with them, who want to know how, if at all, they should change their beliefs and their behavior in the face of other experts who disagree with them. So that's kind of the question that I'm looking at in this little first bit of my new project. And I'm particularly interested in these panels. So here's the kind of scenario. Imagine that you're an expert on one of these panels, and it is a crisis. The aim of the game is you're advising policymakers on an urgent decision. And when you arrive in the panel session, you disagree. Possibly the person you disagree with is an expert within your narrow field. So you're both epidemiologists. But quite likely, actually, the person you disagree with has a different field. Maybe they're as distant from you as economists are from epidemiologists. Maybe you're just slightly different flavors of biomedical scientists. In either case, what I'm interested in is how you should respond to this kind of problem, this situation you find yourself in. So just to set things up a little bit more, the panels that I'm interested in have a few important features. So they're typically, they involve a small number of people, especially relative to like the size of the domain. We're not in the game of like seeing what all epidemiologists think. We're in the game of selecting a few to be our advisors. So often we're talking about like 4 people in small ones. Even in large panels like SAGE, it looks like there are hundreds of people in SAGE, but in any given meeting, not that many people are participating. And especially if you look within disciplines, it's really just a few people who've been selected. The people who are selected, in the cases that I'm interested in, are people who are, by and large, researchers. So their job is that they work in universities or they work in institutes. This is a kind of secondment. It's not their, unlike the Chris Whitties and so on of the world, they're not professional science advisors. They're researchers in some sense who are acting as science advisors. Especially during crisis, they work on very short timelines. So I attended a meeting with some people who were part of SPIEM sometime last year, and they said that the briefing cycle at one point was like 4 days, more or less. On a Friday afternoon, usually a Friday evening, they'd get a call and it would say, here are the questions the ministers are interested in. The meeting is on Monday. I think Monday 10 a.m. or something. And so the time you have to come up with your answers was between Friday evening and Monday at 10 a.m. And so you talk to your network, you do a model run. You couldn't even really redo the model, but you could maybe like put in some new parameters. You'd come up with your judgment. You'd go to the meeting at 10 a.m. on Monday, and by Tuesday there'd be a cabinet announcement of what they were doing. So it was incredibly short timelines. The contexts were almost always unique. I mean, the questions they were being asked were like, what should we do in Liverpool? What's the story with this stuff? The situation was changing all the time. So they were in really constrained environments in terms of resources, information, and so on. And here's an idealization. I'm going to say they're also highly influential. I don't know that that's always true, but I at least want to talk about this as if they're highly influential because it makes the questions seem, pointed and important. So here are the questions I'm asking in this little part of my project. As this expert in this situation, what are you even trying to do? And what are you being asked for? Secondly, given those things and some other considerations, how should you respond to this disagreement? Should you change your position? How should you communicate? All of that I'm interested in. Thirdly, I want to know if that's different to what you'd normally do. So one thing I'll do in this talk is, if I have time, I'll compare how I think these expert panels work and how that's different from just being a researcher and disagreeing with other people in your field, like in articles and so on. And then, given that point especially, what's the best way to get these panels to function in what I'm going to argue is the optimal way? Now, because this is a very short talk, we gave ourselves these small slots, I'm just going to show you this kind of overview of the whole thing. Oh, I would if the slide would come up. There we go. So here's kind of the paper, which doesn't really exist right now, but here's the thought that I have. Advising is a very particular context. It's a context in which you have been pulled out of research, but your role is now to be a part of this machine whose job is kind of risk management. And in this traditional model, which really bakes in some of this fact-value separation, your job is what's called risk assessment. You're there to tell people that there is some kind of hazard, how it works, some sort of maybe causal understanding of it, what the implications are in terms of variables that people care about, so like different dimensions of welfare. you can help by identifying some levers, perhaps like saying what options might be, and that's the game. You then hand it over to people who do risk management. That's the words people use in this world for making the value-laden decisions. It's fast, it's high-pressured, it's very uncertain because of this condition of crisis and the way the panel works. It's highly individual, so you've been plucked from your research context, and now it's kind of on you to be the sort of spokesperson for what epidemiology has to say about the pandemic at this point in time. In a way that science is not individual. Science, the kind of nature of the game is it's highly social, and we sort of incrementally over time can improve. That's not at all what this advising context is like. In this kind of context, my rough thought is that disagreement poses a really difficult problem because it makes it unclear what people should believe, what people should do. And so the argument I want to make is that the experts themselves should be conciliatory. And I have a specific thing in mind with this, but conciliation is one of the strategies that philosophers have suggested to dealing with disagreement. And very roughly speaking, it means like taking the disagreement seriously and so changing your belief in the direction of the person you disagree with. The kind that I'm interested in basically involves moving towards less precise beliefs as you interact with other experts who disagree with you. And the argument goes that this is what's required by the process. So it's a kind of consequentialism, like epistemic consequentialism. The aim of the game is not for you to have like justified beliefs or whatever other epistemologists, like real epistemologists, care about. I just want the system to do what it's trying to do, which is to manage this crisis. My thought is that that's really different from your home context if you're a researcher. Because in your home context, you're in this slow, social world of science. You kind of grandly tell yourself that that aim is truth and not like tenure or grants. But what that does is it leads to a certain kind of social epistemic arrangement in which disagreement is good. Disagreement's kind of healthy, it's good epistemically, and I'll draw a little bit on kind of Philip Kitcher to talk about why it's really helpful for science to have this persistent disagreement. It's also obviously kind of sociologically, it's important. Like we write papers where we disagree with each other and we get grants because of those ways that we differentiate ourselves. And so my concern is that there's a way in which the natural state for a researcher is to be more like a steadfaster, where the steadfaster is the opposite initial response to disagreement that epistemologists have identified, which is where when I discover that Richard disagrees with me, I just stick to my guns. I don't move in the sort of immediate moment of discovering that in the direction of his opinion. Now, if this whole picture is right, the issue is this contrast, that the people who we pluck as our researcher, as our advisors, are the sort of superstar researchers. But the things that we want from them, the characteristics that support the particular operation of the panel during crisis, is this other attitude, which is something like a kind of personality trait or a pattern of behaviors. That's a strategy for managing disagreement. And so the kind of way that the paper works is I say, what do we do about this? That seems like there's something going on there that could lead us to have experts who are going to be like sticking to their guns and fighting it out in a way that's unhelpful. What we really need for them to be doing is something different. Okay, so it's quite a complicated apparatus. I don't have the time to kind of go through all of it. So I've got a few more minutes. What I'm going to do is just show you kind of little bits of that. And then, yeah, we can see how it goes. So, yeah, I'll say something about disagreement. So my overall proposal actually involves different components. I'm arguing in my project that expert advisors need to be humble in the sense of epistemic humility. They need to communicate uncertainty in a way that kind of lines up with this view of decision-making that Richard talked a little bit about, where it's really important to kind of have all the uncertainty on the table and then for the decision-maker to be able to respond to it. And that, I argue, means that these experts should be conciliatory in the fashion that I'm interested in. So a brief word on this epistemic humility idea. I see this as having a kind of personal and an interpersonal part. And the core of it is maybe the personal part. The thought is that it's crucial in a lot of domains, but in particular in this kind of high-stakes expert advising domain, to adopt these kind of, I don't know, virtues, traits, which is, firstly, to take on an awareness of one's own limits, to really be aware that, you know, you're a person who has biases, you occasionally have cognitive failures. Not just things that are failures, though, you have certain commitments which other people may not have and which are, in a sense, kind of contingent features of your personal biography, and that all of those are going to mean that your perspective on something is limited in a certain way. There's also, I think, some ways in which you need to be cautious about epistemic trespassing. This one's difficult. So epistemic trespassing is this word that we use for experts who are experts. They're real authorities in a certain domain, but then they stray into talking about other domains. Like, think of physicists, right? They're the worst at this. Physicists just think that they're experts about everything. It's super common to find a physicist who just like weighs, you know, on how you should do epidemiological modeling, knowing absolutely squat. That's the kind of thing we're worried about. And then finally, I'm worried about overconfidence. And I'm worried here in particular about this research about how people are, in fact, quite bad at making predictions. And there's lots of research about when you ask experts to make predictions and you ask them how confident they are in the prediction, and then you compare their actual performance. So for instance, you take all the predictions where they say they're 80% certain and you gather all of them together. How many of them do they get right? It's way less than 80%. So they're systematically overconfident, and it affects different fields differently. But broadly speaking, I think experts really need to take on an awareness of their own limitations, especially when they're engaged in making predictions. And I think that that has a few interpersonal implications. One is it's important to recognize others' expertise. When you come to a panel and the sort of situation is that all of these people have been plucked and put here to represent their disciplines, I think there has to be at least a kind of strong prima facie recognition that these are other experts. What that means for disagreement, I think, is that given all of these facts, you might be wrong, they know their stuff, your initial view of disagreement should be that there's something going on. They have some information you don't, maybe, not simply that they're likely to be wrong. Now, there's some ways in which this gets complicated. Like, yes, you shouldn't epistemically trespass, but policy problems don't obey narrow disciplinary boundaries, so there's something difficult there that I need to work out. But nevertheless, this is what I want them to be coming in with. All right. Then I have this package of kind of decision theoretic views that it's really important when you're making a decision under great uncertainty, that that uncertainty is kind of surfaced and communicated to the decision maker who can then respond to it. And that requires that they have the right tools, they know how to make precautionary decisions, or they kind of understand what to do when they're given a range of options. Nevertheless, I think what we need to really push against is some of the more political reasons why that doesn't happen. So for example, politicians don't like uncertainty. It's very different from how their world works. They're in the game of like simple declarative messaging. There's also a bunch of just experience that has taught experts that people are bad at handling uncertainty that makes them feel like they have to take on the work of synthesizing, summarizing information in a way that I'm kind of more broadly concerned with. And I think they should shift back in the direction of just communicating the uncertainty. So then we come to the disagreement. So if you're not familiar with these strategies from epistemology, they have a slightly odd format. So here's the basic idea. Imagine you've got a disagreement, right? So you've got these two people, Ali and Bim, and they're thinking about Eurovision tomorrow, and one of them correctly believes that the Swedish entry Loreen will win Eurovision, but her friend believes that Loreen will not. What philosophers are interested in is like, what should they do just with the fact of the disagreement? Before they deliberate, before any reasons come to light, purely based on the fact that they sort of take each other to be worthy interlocutors. So in this debate, they use this very refined notion of epistemic peerhood. For now, you take this person seriously. So the two strategies are these: you conciliate, you change your opinion to reduce the disagreement, or you remain steadfast, you make no change whatsoever. So just a word on this. It's a bit peculiar because it's not about deliberation. So why do we think in this way? One, sometimes you can't deliberate. Maybe the sort of nature of the way in which you learn of the disagreement is like at a distance or something. So there are some circumstances in which this is relevant. Two, how you initially react to the disagreement informs how you do deliberate. The kind of openness with which you enter that discussion, the kinds of questions you ask, I think really change based on your initial response to the fact of the disagreement. And 3, deliberation can only imperfectly share why you think what you think. You often don't know why you think what you think. It's a kind of complicated and subtle thing that comes out of all of your experience, your values, but also just things that you're not going to be able to share with people in a short panel discussion. So those are all reasons why I'm interested in them, because I think expert panels are in this situation where, because of the high pressure, the inability to do new research, the short amount of time, they can't settle disagreements. They kind of have to respond to the fact of the disagreement. And they have to do it in a way which respects the kind of project that they're in, this project of policy advising. So one last thing about this, conciliation is a very kind of broad name. It can mean lots of things. So it can mean like suspending judgment if I believe the one thing and you believe the other. Or it can have this probabilistic sense where we kind of move to having the same odds. Or it can have the kind of thing that maybe I'm more interested in, which is imprecisifying your view. So if you go in with a precise view and you disagree with someone, you end up adopting a view that's more like, maybe it's somewhere between what the two of us thought coming in. And yeah, I don't have too much time to talk about that. So the rough thought that I have is basically this then. The context sets the rules of the game. In this context, you should come in with this attitude of epistemic humility, accepting that other people are experts, that they've got private information and skill. You should focus on the goals, which are to express the uncertainty that already exists. And so given that, the thing you should do is this particular form of conciliation, where you kind of change your beliefs in the direction of forming this attitude that's much more imprecise, responding to the fact that someone else had a certain opinion rather than to any reasons for it. Okay, so that's basically what I really have time for. I don't have much time to tell you this story. So all I'm going to say about this is, I think there are a bunch of reasons you should believe that that's not how science works. And you shouldn't want it to work that way either, because it's not a condition of crisis, it's not the game of risk assessment. It just works completely differently. We have loads of time, we're embedded in these institutions, our epistemic and our non-epistemic aims kind of line up to mean that we keep disagreements going, and especially in disciplines like ours, in fact, we kind of live on disagreements. So that creates the puzzle. And the way that I'm thinking about the puzzle now is basically, it makes it unclear what you're supposed to do when you're picking your advisors. Because one thing that I want to say is maybe we shouldn't be picking the best researcher to be the advisor. But I also don't want to say we should be picking the most agreeable researcher. I mean, that can't possibly be the answer. So there has to be a more complicated story. But the direction that I'm going in is this direction of thinking that there's something about being an expert advisor. It has certain characteristics, and we shouldn't just assume that those are the same as the characteristics that make one a good researcher. Although the sort of level of expertise, in some sense, has to be above a threshold before you can become an expert advisor. Okay, so I'm just going to end there. It's more an advert than an argument, but that's what I'm thinking about.